They came armed with guns and numbers, confident it would be an easy victory. But Luther Gaines didn't run. He fought back, quietly, precisely, with the instincts of a man who had ended wars and survived much worse. The sun had barely crested the horizon over Valverde County when Luther stepped out onto his porch. A steaming black mug of coffee warmed one hand, while the other rested near a weathered shotgun leaning against the house wall behind him. There was no paranoia in his stance, only the calm readiness born of hard training. At 62 years old, Luther's lean frame and heavy, calloused hands told the story of a life shaped by toil and endurance. His skin was weathered like the rough wood of his farmhouse, cracked and worn by years under the relentless Texas sun. Most locals knew him simply as the quiet farmer who never missed Sunday mornings at Bigwell's Hardware and spoke only when necessary. But a few miles away, just across the county line near the river, those who knew the man behind the name still flinched at the sound of Luther Gaines. The cut in the fence was clean, barbed wire twisted and curled back as if sliced deliberately with bolt cutters. Not torn, not shredded by a coyote or wild animal, but precise and surgical, the kind of cut made by someone who didn't want to be hurt. Luther crouched beside the break, eyes scanning the dry dirt beneath the fence line. The wind was too gentle to erase footprints overnight. Sure enough, there they were, 3 sets again. The same deep heel impressions, the same spacing. They had entered and left by the same path, no hesitation. This time they weren't guessing. They were measuring. Luther exhaled through his nose, not in anger, not in fear, but in quiet calculation. He moved silently back along the trail toward the house, one hand trailing over the heads of tall grass. To an outsider, he looked like any other man, sweat-stained shirt, old boots, calloused fingers. But beneath that calm, weathered face, his mind was turning rapidly. By the time he stepped onto the gravel driveway, he already had the perimeter of his land mapped out in his head. Entry points, lines of coverage, angles, trapping lanes. Old instincts long buried now stirred not with excitement but necessity. He didn't want a war, but if it came, he wasn't going to lose it. Inside the shed, Luther pulled down a wooden crate labeled tools. Inside there were no wrenches or bolts, just a long cloth roll tied with a worn leather cord. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay an M9 pistol, cleaned and oiled, 2 extra magazines for stun grenades, a length of paracord, and a K-bar knife with a notch near the base, an old souvenir from some long night in Mosul. His fingers ran over the pistol grip like it was a forgotten language. It didn't feel heavy in his hand, it felt familiar. There was a time when violence had been just a job, not for revenge, not for glory, but orders. Missions: extract, disappear, survive. Now, years later, that same skill set might be the only thing standing between him and death. His phone vibrated on a nearby shelf. The screen lit up with Ruben's name, a low, gruff voice from Louisiana, another man nobody mentioned lightly. "Talk. You get that package I sent?" Ruben's voice was rough. "Yeah," Luther said. "Sounds like you've already opened it. I might need it." There was a pause. "You expecting company?" "They already stopped by. Didn't knock. Heavier this time." "Then you want me to come down?" "No. I need quiet. And you talk too much." Ruben chuckled dryly. "Still mean as hell, still breathing. You call if you need bodies." "I will." Luther hung up without a goodbye. He stood in the dusty shed as shafts of light filtered through the cracks in the wood. There was a strange clarity to it all, a calm before the storm, not fear but sharp awareness. Like a hunting dog sensing the air about to change. He stepped outside, grabbed a shovel, and began working the dirt beneath the back fence. Each day he dug a little deeper, just enough to bury something metal, something that would remain hidden until it was needed. 2 flashbang grenades he placed carefully in a trap just beyond the gate. If they stepped wrong, it wouldn't kill them, but they wouldn't be standing either. A truck rumbled down the distant road. Luther glanced toward it but didn't pause. Just a rancher heading into town. Routine. But routine didn't mean safe. Later that night, just before the sun dipped behind the hills, Luther walked the fence line again. He moved slowly but saw everything. A broken branch, a scuffed rock, a crushed beer can left under the gatepost that hadn't been there the day before. Sloppy. That was mistake number 3. Back inside the house, Luther sat in the dark, no lights on, windows open. He ate cold beans straight from the can and listened. The distant chorus of frogs, the hoot of an owl, and once, a twig snapping too cleanly near the west corner of the field. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He wanted to see how bold they'd get. If the men creeping through his fields thought Luther Gaines was just an old man with a shotgun, they were about to learn how far off the mark they were. At 2 a.m. Luther's eyes snapped open. He hadn't truly been asleep, his body trained for years to rest lightly. He heard it, a faint metallic click, not close but not far either. Someone stepping onto the old irrigation grates near the east crop line. He moved deliberately, quiet, careful steps, bare feet sliding on the wooden floor. One step at a time he reached under the bed, pulled out a soft cloth-wrapped bundle and unrolled it on the nightstand. Inside lay the M9 he'd prepped earlier. The magazine was full, the chamber empty as always. He racked the slide once, soft, controlled, and tucked the pistol into the back of his waistband. Outside, the moon was sharp and bright, casting long shadows that moved too easily across the land. He didn't bother with shoes. He wanted to feel the ground beneath his feet, to know it, to own it. Stepping off the porch, the air was cool and still, no wind, no bugs. That meant something was nearby. Most people never noticed silence until it was forced upon them. He moved along the south fence, where corn stalks grew taller than a man's chest. His breathing was even, his footsteps matched the rhythm of the night, slow, low, almost invisible. Then he saw them, 3 shapes moving low between the rows. They weren't farmers and they weren't lost. They weren't armed like military either, no coordination, no overwatch. But they did have weapons. One carried a scoped AK slung low across his back. Another had bolt cutters that gleamed in the moonlight. They hadn't seen him yet. Luther crouched behind a water tank and watched them carefully. They were not professionals but men used to moving through fear, men who expected people to freeze when they appeared. They didn't expect to be watched. The man with the AK paused near an old scarecrow, glanced around, then muttered in Spanish, "He ain't even got lights on." The one with the bolt cutters snorted. "Probably drunk or dead." The third, a younger man, shifted nervously. "I don't like this. Feels wrong." Luther smiled quietly. The kid was right. He let them move on, didn't confront, didn't shoot. He wanted to learn their rhythm, how they searched, how they retreated. It told him what kind of crew they were dealing with. This wasn't just a smash and grab. This was reconnaissance. They were testing his lines. He watched until they disappeared toward the north fence, then melted into the trees. He waited 20 minutes more. Then they were gone. Back inside, Luther poured himself a shot of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table. The glass felt heavy, not from its weight but from memory. He didn't drink often anymore, but sometimes it helped settle the line between then and now. He didn't like being hunted. The next morning, Luther went into town. Big Wells wasn't much. Just a gas station, a diner, and a hardware store run by Colton Ruiz, a man who'd known Luther long enough not to ask dumb questions. "Need anything?" Colton asked as Luther picked out cable ties, gloves, and a roll of steel mesh. "Just maintenance," Luther said. Colton nodded. "Storm season's coming." Luther said nothing, paid in cash, and walked out. Back home, he spent the day turning his property into a blueprint. He mapped every tree, ditch, corner, and line of sight. He dug shallow trenches behind the rows of corn and installed a tripwire that triggered a flash of light, just bright enough to blind someone unprepared. He didn't want to kill, unless he had to, but he wasn't about to let anyone use his land for illegal purposes. He'd earned his peace and no man, cartel or otherwise, was going to take it from him. That evening, just as the sun dipped low, Sheriff Bruce McLean called. "Luther, you hear anything?" "Last night, some ranchers reported gunshots near the river." "No gunshots here," Luther said. There was a pause. "You good?" "I'm fine." Bruce hesitated. "You'd tell me if something was off." "I'd tell you if you could help." Another pause. "Well, all right. Just checking." Luther hung up, appreciating the call but knowing Bruce had deputies and a whole county to cover. This wasn't his problem, not yet. By the time Bruce understood how bad things were, it might already be too late. The following night, the air was thick and still. No wind, the moon veiled behind clouds that hadn't brought rain in weeks. Luther didn't bother pretending to sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, stripped down his pistol, and cleaned it again, old habits dying hard. Somewhere out there, someone thought they were creeping in unseen. Luther planned to let them believe that a little longer. At exactly 1 a.m., the tripwire clicked, not loudly, just a soft mechanical sound. Inside the shed across the yard, a burst of blinding light flared, quick and shocking. Not enough to wake neighbors, but enough to stun anyone. Caught unprepared. Luther stood and walked outside slowly, M9 in hand. He didn't run or rush, he wanted them to know someone was home. By the time he reached the fence, the intruder was gone. Only a torn strip of cloth clung to the barbed wire, smeared with blood. Not much, but enough to tell a story of panic. Luther turned back without a smile. Not pride, calculation. Later that morning, as the sun rose, Luther walked the western tree line where he'd found the first tracks. Today the prints were different, deeper and rushed. Someone had run. Someone big. He followed the trail a few yards and stopped. There, half buried near a rock, lay a machete dropped in haste. Luther picked it up, wiped it clean with a cloth and kept walking. This wasn't robbery. This was a campaign. They weren't interested in stealing. They wanted to move something through. And they'd decided his land was open ground. They were wrong. That afternoon, Luther drove into town again, same hardware store, different shelf. Need anything? Colton asked again, watching more closely this time. Yeah. Razor wire. Colton raised an eyebrow. You expecting trouble? No. Just company. Colton handed him 2 spools. You know you can call the sheriff, right? I know. And I'm thinking about it. No pushback. Back at the farm, Luther reinforced the northern fence with razor wire and installed motion-triggered lights powered by a quiet generator behind the shed. He even mounted a small solar panel on the barn roof for extra power. Just enough to catch movement. Between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., he wasn't turning the place into a fortress. He was sending a message they were being watched. That night, the lights caught movement again. A brief flash near the cattle trough, and then nothing. No shots fired. No fire returned. But the next morning, Luther found a new kind of message pinned to his front gate with a hunting knife. A strip of canvas painted with thick red letters read, Sal del Campo, leave the field. Luther stared at it, not long, not in fear, but long enough to realize something had changed. They weren't just scouting anymore. They were warning him. But Luther didn't leave. Instead, he went inside, opened a drawer under the counter, and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were 10 pages of maps, aerial shots, and scribbled names, not just his land but the surrounding properties. 3 marked ranches known to be cartel-friendly. He wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. But he needed to know who was on the edge of this fight. As darkness fell again, Luther pulled his chair onto the porch, lit a cigar, not for taste but for the smoke, the smell, the warning it carried on the wind. The farm was quiet. Too quiet for some. But for Luther it meant one thing: the game had officially begun. He never talked about the past, not with strangers, not with the local sheriff, and certainly not with the VA counselor who made his annual rounds. To them he was just Luther, a man who had bought 80 acres 6 years ago, paid cash, installed a gate, and kept to himself. But Luther saw what others didn't. He noticed when the crows started nesting a month early in the southern tree line. He spotted tire tracks near his northern fence that didn't match any of the neighboring farmers' trucks. And he heard the silence, how the wild dogs stopped barking at night, as if something far larger had claimed the land. There was something wrong, and Luther felt it deep in his bones. That morning he walked his perimeter as he always did. His right knee stiffened with the familiar ache from an old injury sustained in Kandahar, but habit outweighed discomfort. The sun was already hammering down on the dry Texas dirt, relentless and unforgiving. Yet this routine was what had kept him alive longer than most of his old unit. Near the irrigation ditch at the edge of his property, Luther crouched and found the proof: boot prints. Not one set, 3. Fresh and deliberate. His trained eye analyzed the weight distribution in the soil. These were no ordinary hunters or farmhands. These were armed men carrying long rifles or possibly wearing body armor. They were careless, and that was their first mistake. Luther stayed still for a long moment, feeling the dry wind stir through the mesquite trees. Insects buzzed faintly in the distance. From his vantage point on the hilltop, he could see straight into Mexico. The river, low this season, was easy to cross for those who knew where to look. Ranchers nearby had told stories of smugglers cutting fences and dumping bundles in the brush. Most farmers called the sheriff and stayed silent about what they saw. But Luther had witnessed things no ordinary man could imagine. He had taken down targets in crowded city streets without a drop of innocent blood spilled. He had survived 3 weeks in the Nicaraguan jungle living on beetles and water runoff. He was the man who cleaned up messes others couldn't, quick, silent, gone before the press ever caught wind. Fear was foreign to him. Preparation was his constant companion. As Luther made his way back toward the house, his eyes flicked to the side shed. The old barn would hid more than just feed and tools, though for now, everything looked untouched. He pulled out his flip phone, the one he kept with only 4 contacts programmed. Bigwell's Hardware, the local vet, Reuben back in Louisiana, and the county sheriff. For a moment he considered calling the sheriff, maybe reporting the prints. But no, he needed more than prints. He needed a pattern. Luther wasn't reckless. That was their second mistake. Back on the porch, he poured the last of his coffee onto the dry grass below. It hissed and sputtered, evaporating quickly in the heat. Trouble had found him, but it didn't yet know the kind of man it was facing. A few miles away on the other side of the river in Coahuila, a different meeting was underway. Inside a warehouse that had once stored grain but now reeked of diesel, sweat, and gun oil, Mateo Rojas paced slowly in front of a folding table. His heavy boots echoed on the concrete floor, broken only by the low murmur of his men laughing as they passed around a jug of mezcal. Rifles were cleaned and magazines loaded with copper rounds. Mateo didn't like to repeat himself, but this time he had to be certain. He stopped pacing and pointed a finger at a satellite image spread out across the table. "That stretch of land," he said, tapping the map with deliberate emphasis. "It's wide open. No patrols. No cameras. Just one old man." Luis, broad-shouldered with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, shrugged lazily. "You sure he's alone?" Mateo fixed him with a hard look. "You scared of one old man?" "No, Chief. Just asking." Mateo snorted. "Then stop asking. Our last 2 runs got interrupted. Federals are watching the river crossing near Acuña. We push through here." He jabbed the map again. "We hit the drop in Bracketville by morning. Easy." He didn't mention the scout they'd found dead 2 weeks prior, halfway across the river, lungs full of water but no visible wounds. The scout's gun and pack were gone. Everyone blamed the current, but Mateo had a rule. If the route gets interrupted twice, it's either cursed or guarded. Either way, he needed a new path. The route through Luther Gaines's property looked perfect. Flat, open land with clear lines of sight and most importantly, quiet. Luis leaned over the map, squinting. "What about this Gaines farm? Some locals say he's ex-military." Mateo shrugged. "Everyone's ex-military in Texas. That doesn't mean a thing." Laughter rippled through the room. One of the younger men, Tavo, grinned and said, "What's he gonna do? Throw beans at us?" Mateo smiled without humor. "You can laugh when we make the drop. Until then, stay sharp." He had been running loads across the border for 8 years. Started small, tires, electronics, mules packed with meth. Now he moved cargo that didn't always breathe, and he was good at it. But Mateo had a weakness he didn't yet know. He underestimated men who didn't talk. As his crew dispersed to pack gear and check vehicles, Mateo stepped outside into the blistering heat. The warehouse sat on a patch of dry land ringed by low trees and dirt tracks carved by years of smuggling. His convoy was almost ready: 2 trucks with hidden compartments, a backup van, and 4 motorcycles for speed and scouting. Lighting a cigarette, Mateo stared across the brush toward the border. That old man's land didn't look like much. He'd driven by once, just a mile off the main route: rows of corn, a few chickens, and a rusted mailbox with Elk Gaines painted in faded white letters. No cameras. No fences worth mentioning. No barking dogs. No hired hands. Mateo had seen many front men, ranchers who took money to look the other way. This one didn't even seem aware of what was coming. That made him a non-factor. 3 men tonight, Mateo said aloud without turning as Luis approached behind him. Luis raised an eyebrow. "You want them to make contact?" "No," Mateo said. "I want them to walk the land. Watch. Listen. Make sure it's clear. Don't wake him up. Don't fire a shot." Luis hesitated. "If he sees them?" Mateo flicked ash onto the dirt. "Let him. We'll be gone by then." He looked Luis in the eye. "We hit the trail in 2 nights. That land is ours." But Mateo didn't know the man sleeping behind that rusted mailbox had once trained others to kill with silence. And that he never left anything to chance. That evening, Luther moved with purpose, circling the edge of his land, but not on the gravel road or the beaten path. He slipped silently through the brush, navigating off-trail where only those who knew the land could follow. No flashlight, no sound, just the steady, measured steps of a man whose years were spent tracking others through jungles, deserts, and back alleys on continents most people couldn't even pronounce. Near the southern ridge, where the gentle slope met the thick tree line, Luther found his first sign: an old feed trough, overturned and abandoned. Scattered nearby were fresh cigarette butts, a half-empty beer can still wet with condensation, and a tarp loosely covering something bulky. He knelt to examine the tarp, peeling it back just enough to reveal 2 duffel bags packed tightly with wrapped bundles: drugs. This wasn't intimidation anymore. They'd chosen his land as a route, and now they were marking it. A twig snapped. Not close but not far, about 30 yards to his left. Luther dropped into a crouch and froze, eyes sharp in the dimming light. He waited, barely breathing, watching the shadows. Movement. A man walked confidently through the field, moving like he owned the place. Flashlight in one hand, a snarling Uzi in the other. Nervous but not trained. Just another man with a gun and an order. Luther could have ended it right there. But instead, he crept forward, circling wide to stay out of sight. He waited until the man knelt down to unzip one of the duffel bags. Then, in one swift motion, Luther stepped from behind a cedar tree, pressing the cold barrel of his pistol against the man's neck. Drop it. The man froze. His weapon clattered to the ground, hands trembling. The guy complied immediately. Trembling. Young. Couldn't have been older than 23. Luther tightened a zip tie around the man's wrists and shoved him roughly to the dirt. Name? Santiago. I'm from Juarez. Not local. Who sent you? Mateo. Mateo sent us. Said it was just a farm. No trouble. No trouble? Luther leaned in, voice low. You see trouble now? The kid nodded quickly, sweat pouring down his face. Tell him this, Luther said quietly. This land's off limits. He sends another man over that fence, I'll bury him in it. Without another word, Luther cut the zip tie and shoved Santiago to his feet. The boy stumbled away, still trembling. No questions. No threats. Just mercy. Luther knew the message would travel faster that way than any bullet. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a man is let him live long enough to remember you. While Santiago ran for his life, Mateo Rojas was preparing something far worse. Something that wouldn't leave just smoke in its wake. They came in numbers this time, 10 men, armed, organized, at least better than before. They moved fast, low in their trucks, speeding down the dry dirt road that cut behind Luther's property. 2 motorcycles flanked the convoy, kicking up dust clouds as they rolled to a stop just beyond the fence line. Luther saw them first. He was already in place, high in the hayloft of the old barn, lying flat with a scoped rifle trained through a jagged slit in the weathered wood. He didn't breathe heavily. He didn't blink much. Sensors rigged in the fields, crude trip alarms made from fishing line and soda cans, had already gone off twice 10 minutes ago. He hadn't waited below. The cartel foot soldiers climbed out of the trucks, scanning the field nervously. One was already sweating through his shirt. Radios crackled loudly, too loud. They were undisciplined. Luther spotted their leader, a tall, burly man with a bushy beard and dark sunglasses. He didn't remove them even in the dim twilight. Command type. Luther thought, arrogant. Used to giving orders, not used to resistance. He didn't take the shot, not yet. He needed them closer. By the time they reached the fence, 2 of them peeled off to scout wider. Big mistake. One tripped a wire Luther had rigged near the irrigation ditch. Snap. A flashbang exploded with a loud bang and white-hot light. The man dropped to the ground, clutching his ears, eyes wide and blinded. The group panicked. That's when Luther moved. He climbed down the ladder fast and silent, stepping out the back of the barn and circling behind a row of rusted-out plows. One man broke from the group, probably trying to flank. Wrong move. Luther grabbed him from behind, drove a forearm under the man's chin, and dragged him behind the plows. One sharp strike to the temple. Out cold. 2 down. Gunfire cracked through the air, wild, uncontrolled. The bearded leader started firing blindly into the cornrows, hoping to scare something, anything. Luther stayed low, crawling along an old drainage trench he'd dug years ago that now ran straight to the house. Near the well, he paused and listened. A third man moved too fast, heavy steps, poor footing. Luther waited until he passed, then popped up, leveled the M9 and squeezed off a single shot. The man dropped. The others shouted in alarm. Now they knew this wasn't just bad luck. They were being hunted. One screamed, "No si están esperando? They're waiting for us." No one answered. Another tried to run but barely got 10 steps before he hit a snare Luther had hidden beneath a loose board. The man went down hard, howling as a steel cable wrapped around his ankle and yanked him backward. 5 gone. The remaining men huddled near the barn, guns shaking in their hands. The leader paced, shouting useless orders. We split. 2 to the house, 2 to the east fence. Move. They scattered. Luther picked them off one by one. He moved like a ghost, using the fog from the busted irrigation line to mask his approach. A shot from the shadows dropped one. A knife in the dark took another. By the time they realized they were surrounded by one man, only 2 remained, the leader and a younger soldier who looked ready to cry. Luther stepped out from behind the silo. Drop it. The younger man complied instantly, trembling violently. The leader raised his rifle, but Luther was faster. One shot to the leg. The leader dropped, screaming and clutching his thigh. Luther kicked the weapon away and looked down at him. You sent boys into a man's land. Spit and blood bubbled at the man's lips. You're just a farmer. No, Luther said, eyes cold steel. I'm what they send when things go bad. He turned to the last man, still frozen. Take him. Tell Matteo this was his last warning. The man nodded and practically dragged the wounded leader toward the trucks. Luther watched them leave, slow and humiliated. He didn't feel proud. He felt tired. But that quiet moment wouldn't last. Matteo wasn't done. Next time he'd come himself. Matteo Rojas stood gripping the back of a chair, knuckles white, inside the quiet warehouse in Coahuila. No laughter. No mezcal. Just silence, and a few bloodied soldiers who hadn't said much since crawling back from Luther Gaines' land. The one who dragged their commander, Hector, back across the border hadn't stopped shaking. Matteo's face stayed unreadable, but inside he boiled. 10 men. 9 down. 1 limping. One message burned into his ego. This wasn't just resistance. It was humiliation, from an old man. A black man. Alone. He turned to Santiago, the youngest of the crew. The same one Luther had let go. Santiago stood near the wall, eyes fixed on the ground. You saw him? Matteo asked, voice low and even. Yes, Chief. You spoke to him? He let me go, Santiago said. Just that. Matteo frowned. No, he said. If we send more, he'll bury them. For a second, no one breathed. Then Matteo laughed, sharp and bitter. An old soldier thinks he's still in combat. He crouched before a local teen, 16, maybe 17. Face swollen. Eyes red from crying. The boy worked at a feed store outside Brackettville. Matteo had his name, his routine, his family's address. The boy had nothing to do with Luther. But he lived too close. That was enough. Matteo crouched and leaned close. You know Mr. Gaines? The boy didn't answer. Matteo reached for his belt, pulling out a small blade. He didn't raise it, just let it rest between them. You'll tell me what he's hiding. What gear he's got. Who visits him. Who backs him. Understand? The boy trembled. I don't know anything. I swear. Matteo's eyes didn't change. You'll bleed until you remember. By the time the boy passed out, his shirt was soaked. 2 of Matteo's men looked ready to throw up. They dumped him by the river that night, alive barely. Word got around. By morning, Luther heard about it. He'd just finished checking traps when Colton called. Boy's name was Trey Morales. Worked at Navarro's feed barn. What happened? Luther asked, already knowing. Some say he was taken, worked over. Dumped near the Pecos hospital. Says he's stable but he won't talk, not yet. Who found him? A rancher near the bridge. Trey had your name in his pocket. Luther said nothing. Colton hesitated. I don't mean nothing by this, but if this is about you, maybe it's time you loop in the sheriff. No. You can't fight this alone, Colton added. I'm not fighting, Luther said calmly. What would you call it? Finishing it. He hung up. Dust blew across the porch. The coffee sat cold. Something inside Luther, something he'd worked years to silence, stirred. This wasn't about trespassing anymore. This wasn't about product routes. It wasn't even about pride. Matteo had touched a kid who never held a weapon, never crossed a fence. And that meant something else entirely. Luther went inside, sat at the table, reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope marked Reuben. Inside was a small thumb drive and a contact list. Reuben's note read, only if the fire starts. The fire had started. Luther plugged the drive into an old laptop, booted it up and accessed the list. 10 names. One stood out, Angelina Vega, a U.S. border intelligence analyst out of San Antonio. Retired but still had friends in the right shadows. Luther clicked her number. The call was brief. Angelina? Luther. Long time. I need eyes on a man named Matteo Rojas. Based in Coahuila. Ties to cartel movements near Del Rio. I'll get what I can. Fast. He crossed the line. Pause. How bad? Luther looked out the window, watching the horizon shift as the sun dropped behind his fields. Bad enough to end it. But while Luther prepared for the final blow, Matteo was already on his way. This time to finish things face to face. Matteo didn't bring a crew, just himself, a duffel bag and a black SUV with Mexican plates scrubbed clean. He left it parked a mile down a dirt road far from the farmhouse. Hidden behind thorn bushes and a cattle fence long neglected. The sky was heavy and gray. Heat still rose from the earth, buzzing with tension. Mateo wanted it that way. No distractions. No screw-ups. No more underestimating the man on the hill. Luther knew he was coming. He'd watched the road through a pair of old Steiner binoculars since sunrise. The perimeter was quiet, too quiet. The neighbors' dogs hadn't barked once. That's how he knew Mateo wasn't rolling deep. He was coming alone. And that meant he had something to prove. Luther didn't panic. He didn't move. Just waited. Until Mateo stepped onto the gravel path leading straight to the porch. No words. Not yet. Mateo stopped 10 feet from the steps. His shirt stuck to his back. Sweat lining his brow. Duffel bag heavy at his side. You really think you won? He asked, voice low. I'm still here. Luther said, calm. You're not. That tells me enough. Mateo dropped the bag with a thud. Metal inside. Sure. Intentional. I could have brought 20 men, Mateo said. You did. Mateo's jaw twitched. Luther stood slowly. No weapon in hand, but it didn't matter. He didn't need one. Not yet. I gave you warnings, Luther said. You ignored them. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed yourself. Mateo laughed bitter and short. You think I care what happens to this dirt? These fields? I've crossed bigger men than you. Made them disappear. I'm not looking to disappear. Mateo took a step forward. You think your past scares me? Delta Force combat medals? You're just an old man with a scarecrow and some booby traps. Luther stepped off the porch. No sudden moves. Just presence. You're right, he said. I am old. But old men don't fight with ego. They fight to end it. You ain't here to win. You're here because I embarrassed your pride. Mateo's nostrils flared. He kicked the bag toward Luther. You know what's in there? No, but I know it doesn't change anything. Mateo crouched and unzipped it halfway. Inside was C4. Enough to level the barn. Maybe more. Luther raised an eyebrow. That's your answer to getting your teeth kicked in? It's my answer to being disrespected. Luther stared at the bag. You came here to burn what you couldn't take. I came here to erase it. Luther took a slow step forward. Now standing 5 feet from Mateo. You want to die out here? Mateo didn't blink. You think I won't? I don't think. Luther said quietly. I know men. You're not here to die. You're here to be feared. But I don't scare easy. Silence. Just the wind rolling through the tall grass. The long seconds between breaths. Luther's eyes dropped to the bag. You light that fuse, he said. And no one walks away. Not you. Not me. Mateo smirked. Maybe that's the point. But his voice cracked at the end. Luther saw it. That flicker. The man who came to destroy but didn't plan past it. You've lost men. Product. Respect. Luther said. You don't get it back by dying. You get it back by surviving smarter. Mateo didn't answer. His hands twitched once. Then stopped. I let your boys live. Luther said. That wasn't mercy. That was message. You crossed this line again. No one's left to send. Mateo looked up. Eyes narrowed. You gonna shoot me in the back? No, Luther said. I want you to walk away. Why? Because a dead man doesn't spread fear. But a beaten man's word gets around. Mateo stared, breathing hard. 1 long minute passed. Then he stepped back, picked up the bag, turned without another word, walked off the way he came. Luther watched him go. Didn't relax. Didn't smile. Just waited until the dust cleared. And the road was empty. Then turned back to the porch. Sat down. Same spot. Same old chair. But while Luther had won the fight, the war had left something behind. Something that didn't settle as easily as dirt. 3 days passed. No trucks. No scouts. No flickers of movement in the brush. Just wind. The creak and groan of the old porch boards. When Luther stepped out with his morning coffee, he knew it wasn't over. But for now it was quiet. He'd walked the land twice since Mateo left. Checked the lines. The traps. The sensors. Found nothing but animal prints. And the tracks of his own boots. He even visited the field where they'd burned the corn. He didn't try to fix it yet. Just stood there staring at the charred stalks. They'd grow back eventually. Maybe not this season. Maybe not the next. But the soil would hold. It always had. Later that afternoon, the sheriff stopped by. Bruce McLean. Dust-covered hat in one hand. Plastic bottle of iced tea in the other. Luther met him halfway down the driveway. Heard you had visitors, Bruce said. Luther said nothing. Bruce sighed. Feds. Picked up chatter. Intel from someone named Vega. She got a tip Mateo Rojas crossed the line. They found a few bodies near the river. Clean work. Scared the hell out of the ones who survived. Wasn't me, Luther said flatly. Bruce studied him. You know people around here look up to you. They may not say it. But they know this land stayed safe because of you. I'm not looking for thanks. Bruce nodded slowly. Just figured you'd want to know. You won, Luther said, turning toward the field. That's the thing, Bruce. You win wars. But peace. You've got to earn that every day. The sheriff let it sit a moment, then tipped his hat and headed back to the cruiser. Luther walked back to the porch, sat down in the same spot, laid his pistol on the table beside his cup. Not for show. Just part of life now. Later, a neighbor drove by. Slowed. Wave. Luther waved back. The message had spread. The cartel would find easier routes. Mateo might live. But he'd never forget the farm. The farm that taught him about the wrong kind of enemy. A man with nothing left to lose. And no one to impress. Inside, Luther made dinner. Just beans and cornbread, the same as always. But tonight it tasted better. He left the radio off. Let the silence do the talking. Outside, the land breathed again. Slowly. Cautiously. Luther had always known peace wouldn't come with folded flags or polished medals. Peace was in walking in. Waking up. Deciding to defend what you loved without needing a reason. Before bed, he pulled a worn journal from the drawer. Wrote 2 lines. They came here thinking it was just a farm. They left knowing it was a fight. Then he turned out the light. Because if you believe peace has to be protected, not just wished for, you share the story. You remember? Luther Gaines. A man who wanted quiet, but fought when silence was broken.